morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to be with me for this 1 hour or so. I'm talking about exploratory testing. My name is Hanna. I am the chairman and CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing. And I'm pleased to be with you for this 1 hour, sharing with you my experience and my views and my methodologies about exploratory testing. This webinar is being hosted by the International Institute for Software Testing, the leader in education-based certifications. You can look at the website. We have over 100 courses covering every aspect of software testing. I'm sure if you have been attending this webinar, you might have already been on the website. Last night, I struggled quite a bit trying to squeeze as much information as possible into this webinar. Want to tell you that this webinar actually is a sort of a concentration of a 2-day workshop that I personally teach, and it is scheduled to be offered on June 20 and 21st. It's a 2-day course or 2-day workshop where you actually learn the methodologies and practice on those methodologies. But again, I thought it might not be a bad idea to get as much as I can out of that course and put it into 1 hour. I think I've done a reasonable job doing that. You will be the judge after I finish. Okay. For those of you who just joined us now, I don't want you to be confused. This is just the course that's going to be offered on June 20, 21st, a 2-day workshop. But what I'm going to be talking about today is really a concentration, an extract of this course. All right. So we'll see how exploratory testing can help us improve the way we do testing, how we can do it safely without wasting much time, and how to make it most effective. Before I start, I'd like you to share with me your thoughts about what do you think exploratory testing is? What are just to give me a sentence or two, and I will share this with the audience without sharing your name. Just tell me, what do you think of exploratory testing? Is it good, bad? What is it? Should we do it? Should we not do it? And so on. And I'm not gonna wait until you provide your feedback. I'm gonna go back in a little bit, look at your feedback and share it. But I need to go because, in fact, I have so much material to cover. Again, as I said, I struggled trying to control how much details I should give you in this webinar. Well, if we look at what I call the test design discipline, you're going to find that it's looking like this. The highest level of formality in software testing is what people refer to as scripted testing. Scripted testing, and that's when you write script and you get those scripts executed either manually or automated. Okay, and those are formal scripts. Now, of course, those scripts, if they are to be automated, then they must be written in some sort of a scripted language. Now, the next level down is informal scripts. And that's when you write English statements or English language or whatever natural language you speak, if you will, that tells you or tells someone how to execute those tests. And typically, of course, informal scripts are not to be executed using a tool. It's not for test automation, but rather it's for manual testing. Now, the next level, in my opinion, is exploratory testing, where you don't have any steps to follow. You just explore. I'd like to make a clear distinction between exploratory testing and ad hoc, because a lot of people confuse them, and I differentiate between them. I'll show you in a little bit in my webinar what's the difference between them and when you do actually exploratory testing and when you do ad hoc testing. They are different. They are actually different. So as I said, scripted testing is You write scripts, manual or automated. If they are automated scripts, then they would be executed using some sort of test automation tool, whatever it is that you're using, and you write the scripts in advance. Normally when you write a script, you have some steps in the beginning to prepare the test environment and prepare what needs to be done before you execute the test. Then you have some steps to run the test itself, and at the end you have some steps to verify your results. There is a misconception about writing scripts. Let me make that clear. Writing scripts is not test design. So when we speak about test design, we're not talking about how to write scripts. Writing scripts is just a programming task, as you know that. Years ago, when the advisory board of the International Institute for Software Testing, they were putting together the body of knowledge of test automation for the certified software test automation specialist and the certified software test automation architect. The advisory board insisted that the very first item or the very first course in the body of knowledge would be test design. Because if you do not know how to design your tests, any scripts you write are useless. So let's not forget that there are techniques and methods by which you can design tests and you can make them very effective. And that's what you have to do first before designing your scripts or writing your scripts. I don't even call them designing the scripts because they're not a design. You're supposed to be writing scripts to tell the tool to do exactly what you want it to do based on the tested design you produced. So the tested design will produce scenarios and test cases, and then you write the scripts in order to ask the tool to do that. So I'm sure this is clear to many of you, but not to everyone. I want to make that very clear because we get those almost every day. We get those questions every day. People thinking that all what I have to do is to learn the scripting language, to write a script. And that's why I always say test automation is not about writing a script. Test automation is not about using a tool. Test automation is in the first place about designing tests, coming up with the test cases that you need to execute. Then you write the script. So if you were to take my course on best practices in software test planning and the design, you would see that I clearly differentiate or distinguish between test cases and test scripts. They're never the same thing. It surprises me when I ask people about what is a test case to you. They tell me that it's a number of steps to follow, either manually or automated. A test case is not a number of steps. A test case is not the steps. The steps are separate from the test case. You need to learn how to design tests. I'm sorry, this is not part of this webinar, but I can't help it. I cannot just speak about scripting and test automation without making that point very clear, right? If you have a different opinion, please let me know. Just to go do this through the question step. All right. Now, if you're going to do manual testing, most likely we write informal scripts. Okay, and those are simply not showing a very specific input or output. They're not using any data. They're just telling you the steps that someone has to follow to run the tests. Only high-level actions. And sometimes there are steps to verify. Sometimes people put the results, but some people do not write those steps because they know what to look for. So now, the next step is exploratory testing. And before I show you this definition, I'm going to take it away from you here. And I want to go to your input to see what you said about exploratory testing. And I got only few people responded to my request here. Someone says, to me, exploratory testing is testing without any plan. I agree with you. Someone else says exploratory testing is testing outside of the box and trying to break things. All right. That's assuming that you know what the box is, right? I mean, if you know the boundaries of the box, then I can agree with you that um, doing exploratory testing means that you're going outside the box. The problem is sometimes we don't know what the boundaries of the box are. I'm surprised that only 2 people were willing to share their kind of insight about what exploratory testing is. Okay, we'll learn all about it here, but I just wanted to know how you think about it. So let's go to the definition. And I just decided to take a definition from Kim Kainer. Some of you might know Kim by the name. He's a great guy. He's written a number of books, and somewhere either in one of his books or one of his writing, that definition appeared there. So let's look at the things that I underlined in this definition by Kim Kainer. He says it emphasizes personal freedom and at the same time the responsibility. So the tester has the freedom to explore, but also he has the responsibility. The responsibility to do what? To optimize the quality of his test-related learning. So Kim Kainer takes exploratory testing as a way to learn more and more about the application we're trying to test. And while we're doing that, we are improving our test design skills, we are improving our test execution skills, and so on. But he also say that test design, test execution, and the interpretation of the results are mutually supportive activities. I can certainly agree with Kim to a certain extent with this definition, because a big part of exploratory testing is the exploration part. But I do have some reservations about exploration. We're going to come to talk about them later on. Let me just define for you how ad hoc testing is different from exploratory testing. Most people confuse or actually use the word ad hoc or exploratory testing to be the same, because that's the definition of ad hoc testing. No pre-design of tests, no pre-scripting, no planning, and even no prior knowledge of the specific behavior of the application. Just explore, try to break things, as one of you said, try to go outside the box, just to go without any planning. And I believe Kim Kainer and others will say that is not exploratory testing. But unfortunately, many people equate this with exploratory testing. I'll share with you in a little bit how ad hoc is different from exploratory testing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not implying that ad hoc testing is not good. Ad hoc testing is needed in some cases. So a lot of people claim that exploratory testing is powerful because it depends on the human brain in finding bugs without any perceived restrictions. Don't give me scripts, don't give me plans, don't give me test cases. Just let me explore and find bugs using my own skills. But guess what? You've got to have those skills. Not everyone can apply this. We are not all the same. Some people are good in exploration, some people are not. So it is a very powerful thing, but for those who can do it, and not everyone can explore. And here I put on this slide some of my concerns about exploratory testing. The first one is the most serious one in my opinion, because if I am not skilled in exploring, I can waste my time exploring all the wrong places, all the wrong things. I like to make the analogy between the wrong exploration and someone who is making a trip somewhere in Europe for tourism. And I go and I take a trip in say the East Coast or Europe or Greece or wherever I want to go. And I spend a week or 2 there. And I come back. Of course, you can ask me before I go, says Magdi, what are you going to do there? And I say, we're just going to explore. I don't have a plan. We don't have a plan of what we're going to do. So I'm going to my trip without planning. None of you do this, by the way, right? None of us would go a trip like that without planning, but let's assume for now that we did. We went into this trip without planning. So I go there, spend a week or two, and I come back. You ask me, how was your trip? I say, oh, it was okay. You say, okay, just okay. So you ask me, did you see some interesting places? I say, "Oh, well, yeah, we saw some few things. But what happened here is that we went without planning. So we went to there. We did the planning on the spot. So we went to this place. We were hoping to see it, but unfortunately, we did not see it as we expected. So it was not the greatest thing. So we decided to leave half of the day and we go somewhere else. And of course, we decided on the somewhere else on the fly as well. So we went to there. By that time, we went to there. The place was closed. Then we started our next day the same way. We said, okay, we're going to go here. We went to there and we liked some of the things we've seen, but we did not like everything and so on. And with that being said, I wasted 2 weeks of my trip not seeing anything. And that's why I did not enjoy my trip. That's what happened to us when we explore and we are not good with exploring. So don't explore unless you know the methods and techniques to explore your application. And I will give you some hints for that. It is true that you don't have any evidence of coverage. If I tell you how much your requirement coverage or how much of the code have you tested, there is no way to know anything, right? Absolutely. Code coverage and requirement coverage are some of the most important things in testing. When we test, we always have to make sure that we have the maximum requirement coverage, which means we test as much as possible of the requirement or the user story, or we tested the requirement or the user story to the deepest level. And also we have the maximum code coverage, because if there is one block of code that you have not tested and it goes in the field without being tested, we don't know how it's going to behave. So no evidence of coverage. We have no clue about what we tested and what not. There is no documentation, that's for sure, if you just explore. No repeatability. If you would like to repeat what you did, I have to bring you the same person who explored it before, and I say, go ahead and run your exploratory testing because you have not documented what you did in the first place, okay? And as a result, if you were to include some of those tests you did under exploratory testing, if you want to include them in your regression test suite, you don't have that chance. Because, and most likely we don't. And I'd like to hear from you if anyone with us today is willing to say, I do exploratory testing, but at the same time, I bring those exploratory test cases back to my regression testing, because the regression testing that you're going to be doing between sprints and between releases, you need to run some of the tests you have executed before to make sure that they're still working. And in my experience, test organizations are missing the chance of including those exploratory tests in the regression test suite. If you actually are doing this, I'd like to hear from you, because that means that you're actually documenting your exploratory test cases. My last bullet there, as you can see, there is no chance for automation because you have not written scripts, you have not documented your test cases. So it's all manual. Exploratory testing is all manual. We know that. Okay, so these are my main concerns about exploratory testing. That's why we need what I call a disciplined approach to exploratory testing. That's what I'm going to give you today and in the course. With this approach, we need to ensure repeatability for regression testing, repeatability when a person leaves, because if the person who's very good in exploration, if he or she leaves the organization, then how are we going to do this job again? So we need to have a way of repeatability. We need to have accountability, because at the end, we need to know who tested what. Because I don't like it when people say, we tested this user story. What did you test? Well, we explored. And there is no evidence of what we tested, and there is no accountability. If you go to status reporting, you need to always talk about how much testing you have done. And most likely you have no way of including your exploratory tests in your status reporting. So as a result, you don't really get any credit for that. If you are working on one of those systems or applications that can be exposed to auditing sometime, then you don't have any way of showing. I mean, imagine if you're working on medical devices or pharmaceutical industry or whatever, where the FDA will come and audit your test process. Exploratory testing, if you're doing it without documentation, it cannot be audited, and you have no way of showing what you did and what you did not do. My last bullet is very important because my view of software testing is more of a quality assurance as opposed to testing. And many of us do not know even the difference. And I'd like to always differentiate between testing, which is all about finding bugs, and the quality assurance, which is mostly about preventing bugs. Again, one more time, in my courses, I emphasize very much quality assurance as a way of doing our job as test professional. Quality assurance is about preventing problems, not about finding problems. Quality assurance is about looking at the defects we found, and we try to understand the reason or the root cause of those problems or those defects, and to try to fix the process where we need to in order to prevent those types of defects for the next time so that we don't continue in the same cycle. Again, this course is not the place for me to discuss for you all the methods for defect prevention. I have another course and another 1-hour webinar in which I speak about defect prevention and how you do testing with QA and defect prevention in mind. But with exploratory testing, there is no chance to do that. All right, here is my high-level process of the exploratory testing. So as you can see, any test process, exploratory or not, has to have 4 phases, absolutely. So if you take my course on best practices in software test planning and design, you will see the same 4 phases in formal testing. So we have test planning, we have test design, test execution, and bug reporting. The only difference or 2 differences here in exploratory testing. One, these 4 phases or 4 sub-processes are done very much concurrently. We don't do sequential process. Okay. And even when we do formal testing, we also try as much as possible to do those in parallel, not in sequence, not sequential process. But with exploratory testing, we do it mostly in parallel. So you can see the timeline for each one of those phases is very much the same with minor deviations. The other thing you see about the process is that there is a feedback from each phase to every other phase. The mindset is this. When, for example, I am doing my test execution in exploratory testing, I am thinking about test design and I'm thinking about my test planning at the same time. So I may have to interrupt my test execution a little bit to go back and revise my test design for the exploratory test, or even go back all the way to revise my test plan. We're going to talk about test planning and test design in a little bit in exploratory testing. But that's exactly what Kim Kainer said in his definition of exploratory testing. All the phases of the test process are mutually interacting with each other. Okay, and collaborating with each other. If I am sitting down and I'm writing my bug report, I need to think carefully. If I need actually to go and do a little bit more of test execution here to look at other cases to include them in my bug report, or otherwise, I may actually even go back and here on this arrow here, go back to my test design and design another test that I should go ahead and execute so that I can either include it in my bug report or not. So I might go back to my test design here. Actually, I might go back to my test execution. I find there is another test case that I need to run. I could actually run it if I have it, or I could go back to my test design and either change my test design and go again and execute, or design another test, but then I might discover that the test that I just designed is really different, very different from the test I was executing. So I go ahead and complete my bug report, but then I take the next test I wrote and so on. So in a little bit, we're going to see what it means to do exploratory test planning, exploratory test design, and test execution, and so on. But this is the process. We do all the phases at the same time. So here I'm just simply defining the 4 phases of the exploratory test process. Exploratory test planning is all about what to test on a very high level. In the test design phase, we think about what we're testing, but on a lower level. And we're going to see the difference between the planning level and the design level in a little bit. And when it comes to test execution, we simply running the tests with an eye for exploration. Exploration for further execution, or exploration for further design, or exploration for further planning. Because while you're executing, you need to always think about if you need to go back and redesign some tests. And when it comes to bug reporting, keep exploring to find the related bugs while you're writing the bug report. All right, again, I understand this is very abstract and does not give you much guidance. So here is, again, one slide where I'm summarizing the whole test planning. If you take my 2-day workshop in exploratory testing, this one single slide takes about almost 1 full day to cover, or maybe about 6 hours, because we practice on every aspect of the test planning. What features we're going to test? Of course, that means simply what user stories we're going to be testing if we're doing an agile project. Okay, if the user story is huge, then we break it down. Says, okay, what am I going to test out of that user story? So that's test planning. Is there any dependencies between what I'm going to test? Because that would help me decide which ones I'm going to test first and which ones I'm going to test later. Most importantly, to what extent will I test each one of the features? Okay, how much am I going to test each one of the features? Under exploratory testing, I'm not talking about formal testing here, because formal testing has its own methodologies that I teach in my best practices course, but I'm talking for exploratory testing here. To what extent I'm going to be teaching each feature? How deep am I going to be diving into that feature? And that is summarized by which scenarios am I going to be testing. Now, I know people think about scenarios only when they do formal testing. I'm going to tell you this. One of the approaches to do exploratory testing is scenario-based, because there is no way to explore without knowing about the scenarios I'm exploring. In fact, if you are a good explorer, you are exploring in terms of scenarios. When you say, I am going to try this to see what happened, you are practically trying a scenario. So yes, you could leave the thinking about the scenario until the time you are exploring, or you could pre-plan your scenarios. And please, I don't want you to get me wrong here. I don't want you to think that once we write scenarios, that means that we're doing formal testing. No. Formal testing has much more than scenario. It is true that scenarios are a first step of formal testing, but they are not the test design. There is so much more into test design. The last thing we think about when we do planning is what do we expect the system to do in response to that scenario? How is the system supposed to handle scenarios? Now, this is a very interesting thing. When I ask people who are doing exploratory testing, they say, well, I don't know. I'm going to just do it. I'm going to just run the scenario and see what happens. Well, are you going to mark your test as a pass or fail or not? Because when we test, we have to know if the test we're running had passed or failed. And if so, how are you going to determine pass or fail if you don't know what to expect? That's why, on a very, very high level, you should have an idea about what to expect. So that if you got something very different from what you're expecting, then guess what? You have to report this as a failure. At the same time, if you got something you believe to be reasonably close enough to what you expected, then what do? You correct your understanding and you correct your expectations. Okay, because part of exploratory testing is we're trying to learn about the system. And there is some common sense that we're expecting. But if you run a test under exploratory testing and you get different results, then you need to go back and say, okay, maybe what I expected is not really what's supposed to happen. But you need to go and verify that with whoever you're supposed to verify with, the product owner, the developer, the business analyst, whoever. Okay, so that's planning. Exploratory test design is about what we are testing on a lower level. Now we're going to start thinking about what input we're going to be using. Of course, someone again would say, if I'm thinking about input, valid and invalid, then I am going back to formal testing. No, but remember, we're talking about a disciplined exploratory testing approach. Okay, we're not talking about ad hoc, where you sit down and try things. I already shared with you my concerns about exploratory testing that we do in the form of ad hoc. There's so much concerns about it. So that's why I'm presenting to you a disciplined exploratory test process. So yes, you have to think about input, both valid and invalid. You also have to think about preconditions. Preconditions are simply all these conditions that exist before you run the test, because they are going to affect the results of your tests or the results you expect to see out of your exploratory test, right? Going back to my example about canceling an order, refunding it, then guess what? Things like whether the order has been paid or not, that makes a big difference. And if the order was paid, how was it paid? Was it paid by credit card? Was it paid by store credit or whatever? Because you expect the system to handle the cancellation and the refund accordingly. Preconditions like was the order shipped or not, because you would expect that the system will handle canceling an order that has already been shipped differently from canceling an order that has not been shipped, and so on. Now, you also need to think about the environment in which you are running the tests. Environments are part of it is the operating system, the browser. It is possible that you are running a test using certain browser, right? And you can come back and says, I wonder how this screen would look like under a different browser. That's purely exploration, and that's considering the environment. Again, one more time, if you go back to my example about canceling and refunding an order, it's fair and it's reasonable to say, what if the credit card processing system that's going to process the refund is down? I wonder how the system is going to handle the refund. Very reasonable. Now, of course, if you're going to come back and tell me that, well, but that scenario should have been tested under formal testing, I say, sure, yes, of course. But if you know that it has not been, then that's the time to explore it and see if what the system is going to do. Now, most importantly, you've got to start to think about what do you expect. As I said earlier when I spoke about expected behavior or how the system is going to address or handle the scenario on the planning level, I am coming back here on the design level. I say, of course, for the input you are using, whether valid or invalid, and for the preconditions you are assuming, and for the environment you are considering, for all these, what do you expect it to see? And please, please, don't tell me that I don't know what to expect because I'm just going to run the test and see what's going to happen. Remember, we always have to have expectations in mind. And of course, if what we get as actual results is very different from what we expected, then we need to verify that. We need to go back to, as I said, the product owner, the business analyst, whoever, the developer, and say, I was running this test on the fly and I expected to see this, but here's what I got. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Because then you may have to go back now and correct your expectations. All right, that is what we do in test design. Very simple. And please don't think that this is a lot of work or it's going to take a lot of time. We're talking about test design here for a given scenario is going to take no more than 5 minutes. Thinking about the input, preconditions, environment, all done at the same time. Okay, now the really important question now is that how do we fit this process in a disciplined test design process? Because that's important. Okay, exploratory testing is always going to be part of disciplined test design process. So if you have attended my courses in best practices in software test design and test planning, you probably would have seen this process there. But again, if you did not, then here is the process you are looking at. Normally start with either a user story or requirement, or if your project is a little bit more advanced, you're using use cases. In all these situations, you typically have some discussions. Collaborative discussion where you review the user story, you review the requirement, you ask questions and you get answers to the questions, you get better understanding of the requirement or the user story. Based on the questions you ask and the answers you receive, you will build your scenarios. Now, scenarios are simply anything that could happen in production. If you are using use cases, then use cases have built into them what we call use case scenarios. Some people call them paths. I call them scenarios. Use case scenarios are slightly different from the scenarios you build out of your user story or the requirement. Simply, they are much more complete. They include a lot of information. They include actually preconditions and post conditions. They include steps and so on. But they are still scenarios. Based on use case scenarios and or scenarios you build out of your user story and requirements, after you validate them, based on that, you build your formal test cases. And now, again, remember, I am only explaining my formal test process. And of course, I mean, I'm not getting into the details of what's included in a formal test case. There's more details into that. You can learn about it in my courses about discipline testing. I have a 3-day course that's available online called Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design. That's when I explain that stuff. But I'm just trying to give you an overview of my formal test process to show you how exploratory testing will be merged into that. Of course, once you have your test cases, you start grouping those test cases into sets. We call them test sets, and all the test cases within a test set will be executed using the same script, whether that script is manual or automated. Okay? So that is, in a very nutshell, my formal test design process. Now, where is my exploratory test process? It's right here when I introduce these 3 boxes on the left. Normally, for exploratory testing, you start with the user interface. You do the same kind of things you did with the user stories, or the same kind of things you would have done with the user story and a requirement. You do collaborative discussions, you ask questions, you review, you get answers to your questions, and go back and forth, and then you build your scenarios. As you are building your scenarios, you might have more questions, you go back and ask the questions and so on. That is what I call an exploratory test planning phase. So although the scenarios are really part of the formal test design phase, but yes, scenarios are also the first step of exploratory testing. I call it scenario-based exploratory testing. No one tells me that, well, are we really building scenarios in the sense that we are doing formal testing? Guess what? If you know that scenarios are everything that possibly can happen in production, whether it is normal or abnormal, whether it is common thing to happen or not a common thing to happen, that's what we need to test for. And that's true whether we are doing formal testing or exploratory testing. I don't know how exploratory testing can happen without thinking scenarios. Even when you do very much an ad hoc testing, and you're sitting there in front of a screen and you're saying to yourself, I want to try this. What you're actually talking about is a scenario. You're just not writing the scenario. So I'm encouraging you, either write the scenarios in advance based on the user interface and based on the collaboration and the collaborative discussions you have, or as you are doing ad hoc, and we're going to see this in a little bit, you think about the scenario and write it down. You need to write down your scenarios. So by writing your scenario, you finished your test planning. Of course, when you write scenarios, you do the kind of things we talked about under test planning. How do you expect the system to handle this scenario? Now you move to the next step, which is exploratory test design, by writing an exploratory test case. Someone says, really, we're going to write test cases? Of course, but they're not the same level of complexity as the formal test cases. They're not. They're very simple. They're simply saying, what is it that you're trying to test and what do you expect? We're going to see it in the next screen. You could also go and do some automation if you wanted to. You can cluster your exploratory test cases together into test sets and write the scripts for that. But that's rarely happening. Remember, when I talked about possible problems with exploratory tests, is that it misses the opportunity for automation because we normally don't document exploratory tests. Now I am giving you the opportunity to write exploratory test cases, put them into test sets, and write automated scripts so that you can automate those, so that you can include them into your regression test suite, okay? Or just keep them as they are, or just stop right here. Have an exploratory test and go and execute it. Okay, that's simply what exploratory test design is. So this is how you plan your scenarios. You look at the user interface. You try to understand. You try to explore. You write some questions and you ask people those questions. You ask your product owner, you ask your developer, you ask your business analyst, and get answers. Based on those questions you're asking and the answers, you write scenarios. Or you might actually be able to just simply write scenarios because the scenario is clear. You don't have questions. All what I'm saying here, if you don't understand the user interface, if you cannot come up with scenarios directly from the user interface, then you got to ask a question. Otherwise, how else are you going to be able to understand how the user interface? So to me, there is no exploration without understanding what's happening. And if you do understand, then you either write a scenario or ask a questions and get answers and write scenarios. So this additional line here, if the requirement or the user story was not given to you and you don't even know what the user story is about. So this is a very poor practice, and I hope your project is not doing that. But guess what? I have personally been involved in projects where we have the user interface, we don't have the requirements, and we don't have the user stories, and we need to test. I'm sure some of you at some point of your life, you were involved in a project like that. And if that is the case, you can come up with the requirements or the user stories. We call this reverse engineering. Reverse engineering. And when you come up with the user stories, then you can build your scenarios as well based on the user stories. Again, this middle box here, I hope you would never have to go through it because it would be a disastrous project. It would be a project that you do not wish to be a part of. But who knows? Maybe some of you with me today would say, ha, 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 this is the project I'm working on right now. I would not be surprised. Okay, I have a simple process here. I call it explore, learn, document, and ask. Very simple. You explore the user interface. Again, we practice on this process a lot in the 2-day course that I was referring to, the 2-day course on exploratory testing on June 20 and 21. Okay, you explore. As a result of your exploration, you learn. Your learning might not be valid because you might learn the wrong things. Document what you think you understood, but then ask questions and confirm your understanding and go back and explore again. It's a very simple circle that help you understand and explore the user interface. Here is an example of scenario. Here is the title of the scenario. You check into a flight after the flight already took off. I say required, that means that at the very least you have to have that. If you don't have this, you don't know what you're testing. If you're looking at this check-in process and you're saying, okay, what if someone tries to check in after the flight has already taken off? Well, okay, try it, but I want you to write the scenario. Here are some of the preconditions you can think about. That the passenger need to have a reservation on this flight, the passenger has not checked in before, and the flight already took off. I mean, these are a given preconditions. If you don't know these preconditions, then you don't know what you tested. And the expected behavior on a high level, you should see a message. Now, this is the scenario. This is the plan. This is how you plan your exploratory test. I don't know what you call that. I call it scenario. Call it anything else you want. And please give me your insight if you're doing the same thing, but you're calling it something different. But that's the minimal level of information I want you to have when you explore, either before you explore or while you are exploring. Now, when you design your exploratory tests, you have a test case number. You have to have a number to refer to the test case. You have the test case title. And guess what? That could be the title of the scenario. And you have your expected results. Looks like an informal test case. This is not formal test case. If you look at my formal test cases, they're much more than that. All these things are optional. Don't even bother. But I want you to have at least those. And it's very simple. Test case title is what is it that you're testing? Now, again, if you don't have time to write the test case, guess what? Create it directly from the scenario. So take the scenario title, it becomes the title of your test case. Take the scenario expected behavior, it becomes your expected results of the test case. And the preconditions of the scenarios are the preconditions of the test case. Done. So I guess what I'm saying here, once you write your scenarios with the title and the preconditions and the expected behavior, then you're done. You have your exploratory test. And I have no problem if you do your exploratory test based on this. I call it scenario-based exploratory test. And of course, how you test more, how you explore more, by changing some of the preconditions, okay? By changing some of the input. You say, okay, well, in this previous exploration, I assumed that the person has already checked in or has not checked in. Let me run another test where the person actually checked in and see how the system is going to behave. Now, this is the desperate approach I was talking about. This is executing the scenarios. This is taking the scenario as is with its preconditions and expected behavior and just execute it. All right, very simple. But please document your scenarios. I have, in the last minute here, I'm showing you the 3 modes of exploratory testing. This is the one I just discussed with you. User interface, you create scenarios, and you create an exploratory test case. Or you have the user interface and create scenario and execute the scenarios. This is the desperate approach. And this is just going and exploring. But that becomes exploring, executing, documenting while executing scripted tests. So you have the scripts that have been written for the formal testing, then you sit down and explore. This is, if you do this last one, that's very much ad hoc testing because you're not doing any of these, right? Please do not rely on this last one by itself. As I say down here, you should always combine all 3. So this is the most disciplined approach to exploratory testing. And it's not formal testing yet. This is a lighter approach. And this is ad hoc testing. Okay, remember that exploration is a skill that you must learn. And if you don't have that skill, don't even try to explore, because you will always explore the wrong places. Always combine exploratory testing with formal testing. We already said this several times. So hopefully this webinar has given you enough guidance to go ahead and follow the process. If you need more details about the process, I have a 2-day workshop that's scheduled for June 20 and 21st. You can go ahead and schedule it. Or otherwise, actually, I have a 1-day course that's recorded already. It's available as a self-paced course on the Testing Institute website. If you can to make the time on June 2021st, then you can go ahead and take the 1-day course that's available as a self-paced. You can take it anytime. You have 30 days to review the course recording as many times as you wish. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope I did not jam a lot of material in this webinar, and I hope I was able to give you some ideas of how to follow the process.